Welcome back to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. Today on the show, Robin Atkins returns for part 2 with John Euler and Dr. Ann Gillies. They have a lot to share with you, whether you're a parent, a grandparent, or a child who's experiencing this at school level. This is really the episode for you, because we're going to get into the teen and the, well, just, I guess, post-adolescent, pre-teen, and teen years. And there's quite the story here, John. So let's bring John Euler into the picture right now. John, part 1 was, well, concerning because of everything that Robin's gone through so far. And, well, I'll leave you to talk about the rest.
Yeah, what's so compelling about Robin's story is not only does she have lived experience that is so vital for people to understand in terms of what sets kids up to be preyed upon and how the trans movement, those that are pushing it, use that as a perfect opportunity to gain direct access to kids and begin the actual grooming process, the manipulation. She not only has that lived experience, but she is a professional therapist. So she brings to the table, she brings to this discussion really the best of both worlds in terms of lived experience and professional perspective. She and Dr. Ann Gillies both have a similar educational background as far as Liberty University. And Robin, thank you for being back with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be able to share my story with you all. I don't know that I would trust it with most people. And so it's such a wonderful place to have to be able to share it and talk about how what I learned from my personal experience and my education is teaching me about parenting and how to help parents and grandparents and teachers and admin who don't agree with what's going on in schools, how to help all of them manage all of this.
What strikes me as so profound, and I'm so appreciative, is you are setting the stage for professional concerns and helping parents and school personnel to understand that we really are running the risk of, and it's actually happening, of being so dumbed down that we are missing the red flag indicators of predation, of abuse. We are mandated reporters, those of us in the field, those that are working with kids. One of the concerns, significant concerns I have, is that this entire push is causing a reframing of the red flag indicators of abuse. We're having to reframe this into issues related to gender. And so no child is going to come out and voluntarily say that they're being perked on.
Go.
And what is so compelling is that those that are in positions of mandated reporting are being now trained or being taught, and it's dumbing down mandated reporters, their ability to meaningfully discern between gender-related issues versus the red flag indicators of abuse. Robin, you were sharing from your own experience that as a young child, you had been perpetrated upon. You were exhibiting those red flag indicators and nobody caught those. And what's so powerful and compelling about your story, and what I appreciate so much, is you are actually sharing that which it takes a survivor a long time to be able to get over the shame. And really, shame is false guilt. And that is a process of giving back to the person that harmed you that responsibility. So that frees you. As a matter of fact, would you speak for a moment that whole process? Because you are really sharing important, vital information for people to understand. And you're doing so from a perspective that most people would not be able to because they hadn't worked through that shame.
Yeah, so shifting a bit from talking with parents and grandparents and those concerned, I want to talk directly to those who are survivors or detransitioners, talking about the healing process. And there's a large misconception on what the word forgiveness means. In a therapeutic context, forgiveness isn't what you did is okay. It's I'm not going to carry your poison with me anymore. And so part of my healing was to acknowledge my shame wasn't the true story. It was a lie trying to state that I was the problem. Shame isn't the same as guilt. Guilt is I did something wrong Shame is I'm a bad person. And so shame is never an accurate feeling. And so I had to let go of the shame that somehow I was to blame for what happened to me, or I'm a bad person, or I deserved it in some way, and put the blame back on the perpetrator and say, I'm not going to carry this poison with me anymore. It is yours. So much so that moving forward, I hope healing for you too. That does not mean I don't have boundaries. I do not trust you. I don't want you in my life, but I wish you well because I'm not going to carry your poison with me anymore. And so there's forgiveness, which doesn't require accountability. You don't even have to share forgiveness with the other person in any verbal way. It's for you to let go of it. And then if there's accountability, there's an opportunity for restoration. So if any of those who had harmed me, my childhood predator or the two men that raped me in my teens, if they came to me today with accountability, seeking forgiveness, that would be so easy for me to do. I sometimes pray that they will come to me because I want them freed of it as well. I want them freed of the chains of what all of that did to them, because when we harm others, we harm ourselves. And so I want them freed from that too. So if there is accountability, we can kind of have some restoration. That doesn't mean I want to reconcile, though. I still wouldn't want them in my life. That bridge has been crossed. Restoration can be done without reconciliation. Reconciliation requires proof of change of behavior ongoing. And so I think that people who look at healing of these things either assume one of two things. They either assume that, well, you've just let it go and you don't care anymore and they're not to blame anymore. Not at all the case. Or they assume I have to let that person back in my life to prove I've forgiven them. Not the case. There are steps to this, and survivors' only responsibility is their own healing.
Robin, add something.
There we go.
Honestly, or not even add, that is probably the most succinct explanation of shame versus guilt and forgiveness that I have actually heard. I mean, I talk about it a lot, and I wanted to just share something else for those of our listeners who are have a Christian background and maybe confused about the whole issue of forgiveness, because we see it all the time. And I used to say to my clients, forgiveness is a process. The same thing. You don't have reconciliation. You don't need reconciliation with individuals who have done such horrific things to you. But to be free yourself, right? That freedom. And when scripturally, when Peter went to Jesus and said, how often should we forgive? And he said 7 times 70. And I always say to people, it's not 490 times. You continue to forgive until the pain in your heart goes away, and that you can think about that memory and you can think about that individual and not be consumed with the pain or the anger or any of the other things that would hold onto you and grip you, and that you just keep doing that. And it's okay to do that, but people have this false impression, as specifically Christians, I find, have this false impression that you have to restore relationships. I'm like, yeah. No way. So thank you for that. I think that is such an important piece for survivors to understand. Thank you.
Well, in fact, what I reference is forgiveness is granted, intimacy or connection or restoration is earned. 100% it's earned.
Awesome.
And forgiveness, the reality is this, for a Christian audience, 1 John 1:9 becomes the template, becomes the basis upon which, because that's how we are brought into relationship with God. Unconditional forgiveness is very conditioned. It's conditional. If we confess our sins, then he's faithful to forgive us. The word confess means to say the exact same thing as the injured party does, to understand the meaning and the implications. If there is no confession, there's nothing on the table to forgive. Therefore, the crux of this and the key for survivors is to understand that you do not have to play pretend, that if the wrong is there, unless the person confesses, then you don't have to take him off the hook because he's never put himself on the hook. So the good news is you can give that to God. Imprecatory prayers are wonderful. 46% of the book of Psalms are imprecatory prayers. You can pray those. That's why they are preserved. That's genuine healing. You didn't see a lot of psychotherapy in the Old Testament. I'll tell you why, because a pile of rocks is very confirming and freeing for a survivor. So I want people to understand that survivors are not responsible for what perpetrators do. And Robin, that's why your emphasis, and that was beautiful, because we have so many survivors in the trans movement that have been sucked in, used, and now are detransitioning. But we'll get back to, but that was super important, right? Because that ties people in knots, that misunderstanding.
And I want to give credit where credit's due, for clinicians especially. There's a gentleman, Everett Worthington Jr., who studies forgiveness, and I use his forgiveness workbook with my patients to help them learn the difference between what they were taught forgiveness is, which is reconciliation, and what forgiveness from a therapeutic perspective is. And it's a beautiful workbook. You don't have to have a therapist to use it. It's free. If you Google Everett Worthington Jr., you can get the workbooks from him for free. But taking it back to like my preteen years, and how I'm so glad you brought up shame, because shame is what kept me, like you said, no child is going to come out and say I'm being perpetrated on. And shame is what kept me from telling people what I was doing. You know, the masturbation at age 8 with objects, the simulating sex by age 10 with other children. I was hiding all of those things with shame. And then when I was 12, I had a sleepover with about 8 other girls, very common. And one of the other girls and I were involved in some sexual activity that was beyond our years. I don't know her story. I don't know if she had been perpetrated on or not. But I had wrote about it in my journal, and my parents found it. And their response wasn't, oh my gosh, I wonder if this is because we know she was molested. Their response was, oh no, what if she's gay? Which fed on top of the shame. So much so that when my dad, who had been physically abusive to me, and I want to say we had restoration before he passed. I do not want to paint a picture of my father as only a terrible person. We had a beautiful relationship for most of my life. And we had restoration in my 20s. And so but I want to be honest about what happened in my teens. So he was somewhat physically abusive at that point, and I was terrified of him. So I threw that girl under the bus and basically said, yeah, she brainwashed me. And I don't know what happened to her, but I've always felt horrible about whatever she went home to, because my parents called her parents, and all of this out of the fear of me being homosexual, which I had never even considered that I was homosexual. The idea of sexual orientation had never even entered my mind at that point, but then it did. Yeah. And then I started wondering, what am I? And so when you have, taking it back to the very beginning, when I was a child and my perpetrator befriended me and treated me as a special, you know, you're my special, and our relationship is special and it's secret, and isolated me, they set me up for this. Everything involving anything related to sexuality is secret and special. And I'm looking now for people who are going to treat me like that. My brain is geared towards predators at this point. That girl was not a predator at all. This was 2 teen kids messing around more than they should have been, probably both of us because of previous trauma. But neither of us was a predator in that case. But at age 15, I was seeking approval of males. My father wasn't giving me approval, and I was geared towards predators. So I invited a boy from my school over to my house when my parents weren't there, and he raped me. And I was predisposed to that. I was so desperate for his attention and his approval. I ignored all the red flags. I violated my parents' rules about not having boys over when they weren't home. I knew why the rules were there. It's not that the rules didn't make sense, but I was so geared towards I need male approval. And the way we get that is by being somebody special, that I set myself up for that. Now, I'm not responsible for his rape. I do not want people to hear that. But as a survivor, it's important that I take accountability for the choices I made that put me in dangerous situations. Because while I wish we lived in a world where predators didn't exist and girls and women didn't have to be aware of dangerous situations, that's not the world we live in. And so I need to take accountability that by inviting him over, it made that possibility for happening. So I'm responsible for that choice, but he is responsible for what he did to me once he got there.
Robin, you just, as a matter of fact, that was so important because with my background with perpetrators, my focus, I'm very hard on them, as I should be, right? But it's important for young ladies to understand, because there is a branch of feminism, and I try to get through to them, which is, again, the guy is responsible. The guy's a predator, 100% responsible. But as you just said, if a young lady is not mindful of how she dresses, and again, I've just opened a can of worms. We don't necessarily, right? But what she's doing, it doesn't shift the responsibility away from the guy, but it's like somebody climbing into an enclosure. There's a famous picture of a woman that wanted to be with the polar bears in some zoo. She climbs over and gets into the pool with these polar bears. And suddenly she realizes, oh, this is not a healthy thing. She barely escapes with their life because she was lifted out. So there are boundaries for a reason. So in a way, be mindful where you go. If you are going to a bar, if you're going to a nightclub, right? Who's in those waters?
Well, and I want to address the whole how a woman's dressed thing, because a way a woman's dressed is not going to make a man who's not a predator suddenly become a predator. But what it does do is men that are predators see women dressed provocatively and know, her frame of reference for what makes her important is how sexy she is and her body. She is already predisposed for me to feed into that. Your worth is sex. And so that's what they see. It's not that a woman dressing is going to make somebody a perpetrator. It's that perpetrators are geared towards easy targets. And to them, a woman dressed more provocatively already has lower defenses than a woman who's not. Whether that's true or not for women, that's how predators see it.
But that is so important, Erin. So important. I'm so glad that you identified that, because as a woman, I have there's all of these things, and I have all these kind of questions I have to formulate, and I can't quite get to it. But this whole issue with the feminist movement and some of the things, the errors that have been created, the errors of thinking for women, need to be addressed. And you've just done a great job of doing that, because I think, well, we don't want to set women up as, they're responsible for this, but we have to be, like you said, the accountability. So what other places would you see that a woman taking responsibility comes into, like in that whole area, not responsibility for the action, the rape, I don't mean that, but responsibility for her own self and her own behavior, and especially for victims, something that you could say to survivors, previous survivors of sexual assault. How do they then begin to address this whole issue of how they look and what they do? How do they begin to take back some of those things so that they're able not to entice, in the sense, that's the wrong word, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, so they don't make themselves vulnerable.
Thank you very much.
No, yeah, your heart is so beautiful, Anne, and I hope anybody who would say otherwise can come talk to me about it, because I understand what you mean. You are not painting women at all as the problem. No. They can unknowingly make themselves more vulnerable, and I think it's important to go very back to the very beginning. When I work with survivors, what is your worth? Because that's the key to what all of my shame and all of my getting myself in bad situations was about. My worth was tied to, sex to me wasn't an intimate thing between two people that loved each other. That was robbed of me before the age of 5. Sex to me was power. And so I saw my only way of having power was my body and what I could or couldn't do with it. And then the rapes that happened after that just reaffirmed that for me. So for women, What is your value in? And what I would suggest is your value is in your uniqueness that you were meant to bring to this world that has nothing to do with your physical parts. It has to do with your heart. You were given something your heart is on fire for, something you're uniquely attuned to, something that you see a perspective other people don't see, and your worth is for other people to learn and grow from you. And so on top of what is your worth, I want to give a few key things to survivors that helped me with my healing, which was number one, I had to stop intaking data from the world around me that said my worth was my body. So I stopped buying any magazines that promoted women's worth as their body. I stopped watching any shows that did that. I just stopped taking in the messages that women, their worth is based in sex. On top of that, and this was probably the hardest part of my healing, after my rape at age 15, my parents found out about it because they had read my journal, which I do not blame them as a parent now. Of course, as a kid, I was mortified, but as a parent now, I totally get it. They read my journal and found out that way. And my dad's response was, well, if you weren't such a whore, this wouldn't have happened. And at the time, that deeply cut my heart. But part of my healing was to understand his perspective. And as an adult and a mother, what he was saying to me in those very harsh, demeaning words was, because you violated my rules, I couldn't protect you. That was his own pain from not being able to keep me from being my own worst enemy coming out in an attack. And like I said, we had restoration and healing a few years later, and for the majority of the rest of his life here. So, but it wasn't even until I was 40 before I realized that response from him, while very harsh and harmful to me, and he did reconcile that, was pain weeping out of his mouth in those words. Because if I had just obeyed his rules, he wouldn't have had to deal with the fact that this other student I go to school with, and he has to see at different band practices and shows and competitions and whatever, he has to see the guy who raped me multiple times a year. So what that put him in as a parent, I can't even imagine. But part of the healing process is to look at all parts of the situation and try with grace and mercy and understanding and let go of what isn't yours. So my dad's response isn't my fault. That's his fault. But also understanding how I hurt him and the choice I made. Again, rape is not my fault, but I did violate my parents' rule, and that was my fault. So your healing journey may be ongoing, and there are lots of layers to it. Mine is still ongoing. But it's important to consider where your worth is based out of and give yourself time. You'll get there.
I'm just so amazed at your wisdom. Honestly, it's beautiful. Can I just ask you this question? What changed everything for you from becoming, like, you saw yourself as a victim? You actually responded out of that victimhood and therefore were further victimized. How did that all change for you?
Well, when we get to part 3 of the story, we'll move into my 20s. It gets worse before it gets better, but I promise it gets better. So everybody watching, hang in there. I know this is tough stuff and difficult topics. It does get better, though. I will get a sneak peek. What changed for me was identity, but not the way that we talk about identity today. My identity is rooted in something that's eternal, not something that's in me and not a part of me. It's not a demographic. It's something that is forever and something that is so true and so profound that it cannot be undone by this world.
I can hardly wait to hear all of this. And I think that our viewers are probably sitting on the edge of their chairs right now. Honestly, this has been such a wonderful, wonderful time that we've spent with you, Robin. I just really applaud your courage.
Oh, thank you so much.
Robin, we obviously here are we're up against the clock. Give viewers a sense of, because what we'll do is we'll pick up where we're leaving off. But as you said, it gets worse before it gets better. Let's address that for a few minutes. We'll then pick it up, still kind of in the midst of that difficulty, because you had, and you shared with me, I know what you're going to reveal now. And this is, I think, being repeated time and time again. But this is such a profound experience that you had. So share with us kind of how it got worse. And then how do you like that? In 2 or 3 minutes, share with us the worst thing or part of it. But then we will pick it up and people begin to understand the layers of pain that survivors can carry. It's very profound.
Yeah. So I want people to remember my brain is geared towards predators at this point. It's geared towards seeking validation from those who see me and my worth as my body parts, which is the same for transitioners and detransitioners. Predators see their worth as body parts, and can we change them? Same thing. So after that, a relationship I got into in high school, I again was raped. This was by somebody I was actively dating. And there was deep shame for staying with him after that rape. And I do, in the next segment, want to talk about that, because so many people go through that and think I was due what happened to me because I stayed. And I want to address that both from a sexual assault, but also domestic violence perspective. Also with detransitioners who they stayed within those communities that were harming them for so long. Why they stayed. I want to address that. Then in my early 20s, I was in a relationship where I thought I had been cheated on, and I didn't trust the church at that point. And we'll discuss why in the next session, why I didn't trust the church at that point. I didn't trust my parents, and you can start to see why so far with what I've told you so far. So I turned to Planned Parenthood, and while they did treat my STD, and I give them kudos for that, they also sold me an abortion. And the devastation from that is far worse than any of the abuse I went through. My hand at being involved in the death of my child has been the biggest trauma that I've ever had to work through in my life. And when I just the other day, somebody was talking about transition regret. And I said, man, this sounds so much like abortion regret. You can't undo what you've done. I can't undo what I've done. But we can heal. And so that's where we're headed.
Robin Atkins, you're amazing. I appreciate your work, your personal story. We could even say your ministry.
Thank you so much.
We look forward to you coming back, and we'll pick up at this point. Thank you so much for the hope you're extending to people. So
thank you for the opportunity.
Brad, this is amazing story.
It is part 4 coming up will be even more compelling, obviously, and I think that this story is going to resonate with other parents along the way. I think that there's parents out there who are in their 20s right now, and you've kind of addressed them today on the show, and I think that as you head into your 20s, you're going to be able to help them with what's ahead or what's to come for them as they move forward with even more than what was thrown onto you as a child. The trans movement has definitely played its role in where we're at today, and some of the things that have happened along the way have really paved the way for this movement to take shape like it has. And you know, we need to do our due diligence now to try to affect that and stop that dead in its tracks, so that no more children and women are hurt or unduly influenced or just flat out wiped off the face of the earth. So thank you very much for being here, everybody. I look forward to our next episode. Remember, you can find us on BitChute under Unmasking the Trans Movement. You can also check out our website at unmaskingthetransmovement.com. All the info is there to help parents, grandparents, and kids alike. I'm Brad Wilder. For John Euler, Dr. Ann Gillies, and Robin Atkins, we'll see you next time.